Tonight on Nation to Nation, Canada's correctional investigator says the Department of Corrections may have a large budget, but Ivan Zinger says it is not money well spent.
I don't care how much people spend if they can get good correctional outcome and show improvement, but this is an organization that is struggling.
Candace Wilson of the First Nations Climate Initiative says they have a message they want the world to hear.
That Indigenous nations in Canada and in BC are leading the way to mitigating climate change.
And a Liberal MP is part of a movement that wants big polluters held criminally liable under international law.
As we see with air pollution, as we see with some of these climate change events, as we're seeing with droughts and floods, we need to be holding them more accountable.
And welcome to Nation to Nation. Every year, correctional investigator Ivan Zinger comes out with his annual report. And every year, the news gets worse about the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in federal prisons. They make up 5% of the overall population, but make nearly a third of all individuals in custody. In addition, they're most likely to be subjected to use of force, enter prison at a younger age, spend more time behind bars, and when released are more likely to reoffend. So is there any good news? Well, to answer that and talk about more, I'm joined by Dr. Ivan Zinger today. Welcome to Nation, Mr. Zinger.
Well, thank you. It's happy to be here. Thank you.
And of course, unfortunately, a lot of your reports have had, bad news or recommendations not followed by the government. But maybe you can tell us about some of the good news that has happened in the past couple of years or year in terms of corrections and Indigenous people.
Yeah, well, every year APTN calls, and then I come in your studio and I'm a bearer of bad news. And unfortunately, this year is another of such a time because, as you mentioned, the overrepresentation keeps getting worse year after year, and correctional outcome from Indigenous incarcerated people is also getting worse. So very little good news in this annual report again. There's a bit of hope. I at least should mention that. The Department of Justice is in the midst of developing criminal justice strategy for Indigenous people, and hopefully through the consultation and through some of the recommendations we've made, we may see some positive outcome and a change of direction, because it's absolutely needed in this area. We need bold reforms, not just little tweaks and more money.
Right. Now, this issue of overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the penal system is nothing new. In fact, reading your report more thoroughly this morning, we noticed even going back to 1974, it had been earmarked as a problem in Canada. And of course, you had this report that you did 10 years ago, or that it was out of your office on the problem, and you're studying it. So why is this issue so hard to tackle? It seems to be so little movement.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Certainly, when I first entered the public service, the rate was about, so that's about 25 years ago, the rate was about 15% in terms of the overrepresentation in federal custody, and now we are hovering around 32%. And every year it keeps getting worse, independently of what government is looking after Canadians. So it's something that absolutely needs to be looked into, and that clearly the approach of the government, of any government, isn't improving the situation for Indigenous individual in the community, and certainly not in corrections.
Okay, and I noticed a lot of your report, as it pertains to Indigenous people in this year's report, talks a lot about healing lodges, Indigenous healing lodges, and how it's been sort of maybe a missed opportunity, underutilization. Can you just talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, so exactly almost to the day, was yesterday, the Corrections and Conditional Release Act was enacted, so 30 years ago. And there were some very progressive provisions in that legislation that allow the Minister of Public Safety to enter into agreement with Indigenous communities or groups to transfer the care, custody, or supervision of Indigenous people to those communities via typically healing lodges, but there were also provisions for supervision of individuals in the community. There were great hope at that time, and the entire world who were struggling with Indigenous issues were looking at Canada. And it started well. We created a number of them, and there were all sorts of different talks with different communities, but all that stopped in the year about 2000, where Correctional Service of Canada decided to, instead of investing in those communities, to take the money and redirect it to institutional corrections. And then they created those pathways units, which unfortunately do not serve Indigenous incarcerated people very well. And it's a shame. So there are only a few of those healing lodges managed by Indigenous communities. They do great work and they work better, yet they are underutilized. When we looked at it, there were about 50% capacity, which is a shame, with very few beds available. And more than 4,000 Indigenous incarcerated population in custody with CSC. It's a real puzzling findings that they wouldn't fully utilize even the beds they have, given that they have so few beds available.
Thanks, yeah, and maybe we'll just move to quickly here the very large budget that you talked about of corrections, which is larger than I think, or many people realize what it is. It's substantial in terms of employees per prisoner, and you went over that yesterday. But what you seem to say, this is not money well spent. What would you like to talk a bit about that? How you would like to see resources allocated in a different way?
Yeah, so it's an extraordinary situation. The annual budget for correction is $2.9 billion, and they allocate about less than 6% to community corrections. And if you divide that amount by 12,500, which is the number of incarcerated population, you come up with a staggering number that it costs almost $190,000 per year to keep a person in federal custody. We also know that the staff inmate ratio is one of the highest, if not the highest in the world. So there are actually 1.2 staff per prisoner in federal correction, a ratio that I think is unequal anywhere. And then finally, in terms of the infrastructure, corrections has more than 4,000 empty cells right now, which represent about 8 penitentiaries. So I keep saying that I don't care how much people spend if they can get good correctional outcome and show improvement. But this is an organization that is struggling to change correctional outcome and should be looking at other alternatives. And one of them we talked about it is about reallocating significant portion of the CSC budget to fund community, Indigenous communities, so that they can look after healing lodges or supervision of Indigenous people and get better results than the service. The same thing can be said about transferring some of the programs outside corrections, because we know that when you deliver programming in the community, you actually get better results than if you deliver the same program in institutions.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, but thanks very much again, Mr. Zinger, for joining us today. As always, it's a pleasure, and pleasure to see all the good work that you're doing. If it's not always listened to, we certainly appreciate it.
Thank you, Fraser.
Yeah, we'll leave it at that. Thanks very much. And we'll be right back after a short break with Candace Wilson of the First Nations Climate Initiative. Welcome back. The 2022 United Nations Climate Change Conference begins next week in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Joining the Canadian delegation is an organization called the First Nations Climate Initiative. FNCI is made up of 4 First Nations in British Columbia: the Haisla Nation, Metlakatla First Nation, the Niska Nation, and the recently joined Halfway River First Nation. Joining us today is Candace Wilson, the Haisla Nation Council's environmental manager. Thanks very much for joining us today, Ms. Wilson.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, and it appears that FNCI really wants to approach climate change from a global rather than just a national or even provincial perspective. Can you tell me why the organization thinks this is so important and that it has a role to play in this?
So with us going to COP27 in Egypt, we're hoping that we can make connections on a world stage. So it's a networking opportunity where we can share knowledge amongst other Indigenous people around the world and share our knowledge on what we've been able to accomplish within Canada and within BC. And so that world stage, I think, is going to be quite important. And I just hope that we're successful in being able to bring that to COP.
Okay, and I wonder what you say in terms of your organization, particularly not so much in British Columbia, but of course next door to you in Saskatchewan and also right next door in Alberta. These are oil-producing provinces, and I mean they have First Nations that are being pressured. Some of them want to get in on the oil economy for the jobs and money it can bring into their communities. What do you say to these communities?
Within FNCI, so First Nations Climate Initiative, we're more than welcome to inform other nations, whether it's within BC or in other provinces. We encourage them to investigate into what we've been up to in the last 3 years. And if they're interested in joining, then they're more than welcome to come and participate in our meetings that we have. We have a weekly meeting, and we have other area-focused meetings that we convene maybe on a monthly basis. So we're more than happy to have other Indigenous nations come aboard and join the forces that we have right now. Okay,
and I note that you support sort of carbon neutral forms of energy. One of those is natural gas, and it's discussed in your literature. Now, of course, the LNG pipeline is being built in British Columbia. And it is a somewhat controversial project. So where does the FNCI stand on that project?
So within FNCI, we talk about LNG from the new energy perspective and developing a low carbon product coming from BC and exporting it to other countries that are on higher carbon emission fuels. And so a part of that puzzle is the pipeline. We need the pipeline to be able to get this product to other countries that require it and reduce their carbon emissions and greenhouse gases. And so, yes, it's controversial, but from a technical perspective, as my job, we have boots on the ground with this particular project, and we keep them to task on being environmentally compliant, and we ensure that the work that they're doing is very minimal impact to the environment. And once the pipeline is complete, then we will have natural gas being exported to the Asian countries.
Okay, and of course, you'll be on such a large world stage in Egypt, and you'll have a presentation. What is it but you'll only have so much time, I guess, to present, and so many, you're on this world stage, and many people organizations, countries to present to. What are you really hoping that, I guess, the world at COP27 takes out of FNCI's presentation?
That Indigenous nations in Canada and in BC are leading the way to mitigating climate change, and hopefully other nations can get motivated and be inspired by the leadership that we're taking in our country. And we hope that our leadership within the federal and provincial government can hear this message as well. And it's super exciting that Haisla Halfway River nations are going to be there in person. We do have our elected chief counselor, Crystal Smith. She's pre-recorded her message for COP, as well as the president for Nisga'a Nation, President Eva Clayton. She also pre-recorded her message at the front end of our presentation. So having this world stage for our leadership, and they are also Indigenous women, strong Indigenous women. I hope that this message is loud and clear.
Okay, well, it sounds like it's going to be a very exciting time for Canada and for FNCI, so we'll be watching with very attentively to see how things go. And thanks very much again, Ms. Wilson, for joining us today, and have a safe trip to Egypt.
Thank you so much.
We'll be right back after these short messages with Liberal MP Jenica Atwin to talk about the Stop Ecocide movement. Welcome back. Stop Ecocide is an international movement. It wants to hold large-scale polluters accountable by making them criminally liable under international law. Earlier this week in Ottawa, MPs from the Liberals, NDP and Green Party held a press conference in support of the initiative. New Brunswick Liberal MP Jenica Atwin was there, and she joins us today. Welcome to the show, Ms. Atwin.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, so I'm going to start off, I guess, with the first question that we were wondering is, you know, why does it not enough just, I guess, to fine heavily large polluters? Why does this have to be actually made a crime under international law?
I mean, we currently have a system where, you know, you pay if you're you know, accused of an infraction, and you move on. And I think that we see so many of the big polluters, just kind of it's part of their daily budget, you know, plans is to ensure that, well, we can compensate when we make these kinds of decisions, even though many of us are paying the price, as we see with air pollution, as we see with some of these climate change events, as we're seeing with droughts and floods. We need to be holding them more accountable. I understand it's complicated as well, you know, in kind of changing the Rome Statute and international law, but it's a big step. And I think for me, it signals, you know, to the world, it signals to Canadians in particular and New Brunswickers back home that we're taking this seriously, that we're meeting the challenge head on, because it's, you know, it's a crisis. And sometimes it seems like we're putting it on the back burner, and we need to meet the challenge with, you know, something like an ecocide law.
Okay, and as you know, of course, when you start talking about international law, everybody talks about, is it enforceable, or will people, you know, sort of, or countries, sorry, pay attention? In particular, countries like, you know, China, that have a lot of economic power, and large country that are also a big polluter. So how do you make it that it is actually enforceable?
I mean, that's the good question as well. And I don't come from a legal background, so I'm more from the environmental standpoint, that, again, it's about offering that hope. It's showing those meaningful steps and actions. So it's going to have to come from international collaboration. And we see some of that. We've got, you know, COP15 coming up. We've got some of the conferences of the parties globally. It's just not enough. And so it's really about, it's to me about just showing that we're calling for these larger actions, that we want large polluting countries like China to really step up and do their part as well. We'll see if that's a utopian ideal or not, but I think it's important to at least start that conversation. That's really what our goal was with the press conference.
Okay, and some people might accuse Canada of maybe that they need to clean up their own backyard. There's, of course, we have large polluters here. We covered them in some of the stories. Some of it affects a lot of First Nations as well. So what would you say to people that say, okay, we need to just focus on Canada first and our polluters and let the world worry about itself?
Well, certainly we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We absolutely have to look at what we're doing here domestically, but as we know, there's global factors that are absolutely contributing to climate change. And so there's a piece of that. Being leaders as Canadians, I think, is really what we're trying to show. But again, we can do both.
And speaking of First Nations, again, of course, on their ancestral lands, as you know, in your province and here everywhere out west, they have paid the price, really, particularly of, more than any other Canadian in terms of pollution on their lands. Do you think we should bring them into this conversation so that they could maybe actually criminally charge companies that are abusing their lands and polluting on them?
Absolutely, Indigenous voices have to be centered, you know, front and center in this conversation. I'm excited to see legislation such as the environmental racism law that we're going to hopefully see passed in the House of Commons, because it really acknowledges that Indigenous communities have been the most impacted. And again, you know, internationally bringing those other voices together, it's just about showing that collective action, that we're stronger together, but certainly Indigenous voices have to be front and center.
Okay, and we noted this was advertised as a nonpartisan press conference, and that's kind of what Stop Ecocide is, I think, internationally as well as a movement. So that you were there, but not as a Liberal, of course, as an MP, I guess, or not partisan way. And a member of Elizabeth May was there, and also Alexander Belarus, I think, was the other person. But I know Conservative was invited or supposed to be there, but was not there. Now, I just have to ask you, are they really on board with this? Because it hasn't been really, their party has not been very interested on the sort of environmental file, and in particular on charging or fining companies that are polluting.
I don't know. They haven't been at any of the meetings that we held, prior to the press conference. I was surprised to see that there was going to be a representative from the Conservative Party there. He didn't show up at the last minute, which I think speaks for itself. So we've got more work to do as far as making this a truly nonpartisan issue, because of course it's going to take all regions of this country to ensure that all voices are heard. And so I hope that our Conservative friends will come along with us and ensure that this is their top priority as well. So we eagerly await a climate plan from the new Conservative leader as well. So it's frustrating to see that we still don't have that kind of commitment across all party lines. I know that the Bloc is very much committed, to environmental practices as well. Monique Posey, for example, is an excellent leader. So we've got most of the House kind of in that consensus that the time is now to act. The time was actually, yesterday. But we certainly need Conservatives to step up in a big way.
Okay, and I noticed that I've just doing my brief research, this movement is very international, and it's quite big, maybe bigger than Canada and Europe and other countries, perhaps. And there's also a very large youth component to it. Did you want to talk a little bit about how important young people are in the Stop Ecocide movement?
They need to know that we're working on this. They need to be able to look to their representatives and feel a little bit of comfort that we're actually taking this seriously and taking those necessary steps. So, I worry all the time about that eco-anxiety that our youth are feeling. It's very real. It's impacting their lives. Many are choosing perhaps not to pursue even certain careers or education or have families. That's really devastating, because of course we want to make sure that all youth are seeing themselves in a future that generations to come. I think, again, as my perspective from a mom, is that I look at my children and I have to be able to know that I'm doing everything that I can, especially with this incredible privilege that I have of being a member of Parliament. So the youth are front and center in what I do, and certainly in this movement, and it's really incredible to see that.
Right, and as we know your background. You started out with the Green Party, and left, and then went over to the Liberals, and then won again as a Liberal, which is, that's quite rare, actually. So congratulations on that. It must show a lot to your constituency work, because it is a rarity that people, that can go to another party and be successful. But at the same time, it seems that these issues with the environment are really dear to your heart. And is that correct? Are you really? It sounds like you're really pushing the environment within the Liberal Party.
Absolutely. And, I get asked all the time about how it's been, how I've been treated, and I feel completely respected. I feel that my voice is having an impact. I am so grateful that I'm able to, have the ear of the minister and his staff when I have questions, or I want to really kind of push the needle a little bit on some of our approaches and policies. So I just feel like I'm really able to make a difference. And so I'm going to kind of try to capitalize as much as I can, and that's why it was important for me to be a part of this ecocide movement.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there, but thanks very much once again for joining us here again in the studio, and keep up the good work in Parliament.
Oh, thank you so much.
Okay,
thanks for having me.
Thanks very much. Okay. And that concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast by going to aptnnews.ca/podcast. Good night, and see you next week.